Chapter 9 No Sweet Without Sweat. It was bright daylight when I awoke, and already all about was bustle and activity. While I still slept, the women had fetched down huge quantities of corn cobs from the store. From the little stream they now carried up water in round clay pitchers, washed out the chicha jars, and filled huge cooking vessels with water and maize. I rubbed my eyes sleepily, swung out of the hammock, and folded my blankets. Bom dia, came a voice from behind me. It was Vito, the chief, wishing me a good morning. He shook hands with me and was about to embrace me again and slap me on the back. But this time I merely looked at him in astonishment, and the intelligent Vito soon realized that I did not wish to learn any Brazilian manners from him. I soon found out how the Tupari wish each other good day. "Epaka neon," they inquire, "are you awake?" And the answer is, "Vepaka on," I am awake. "Poré," it is well, the first speaker then says with a smile, and later this was the greeting which the Indians gave me month after month when they passed by my hammock as I was getting up. But to return to Vito, here I chief work cut tree, he declared, and looked at me, as if asking permission to go land clearing. "Este bom," I said, and the chief returned to his place, which was some 30 yards away on the other side of the hut. Then Karumi came and took me off next door to breakfast. Together with his father Kwarume, we ate a mutton fowl which he had shot the day before. Now and again the women and children cast a quick glance across at us. They were all naked and wore only the usual adornment of the Tupari: wooden pins in the ears and lips, earrings, necklaces, bracelets, and cotton circlets round their wrists and legs. From a short distance off, the crash of falling trees could be heard. Vito and his men were clearing a patch of jungle to make fresh plantations. I sat down again in my hammock. The light which came in through the doorway was enough for me to make a few entries in my diary. All around, work went forward. The women poured the first cooked maize into a wooden mortar. This huge grinding apparatus, shaped from a block of wood, about 1.5 yards long, stood with its base let into the ground and reached up to the breast of the sweating cooks. The pestle terminated at the top in a handle which could be grasped, but was so heavy that a man could carry it only with difficulty. When the grains of maize filled the mortar almost to the brim, several women took the pestle by the handle and rotated it. Slowly the cylindrical head mashed the maize into a yellowish pulp. Once again I was offered plenty to eat. I asked myself whether this high living could continue, ate anything I could manage to swallow, and laid by the rest on the store shelf above my hammock and on the nearby wood pile. But next morning I had the chance of acting the host myself for once. Young Moam had brought down an ape with my shotgun and had roasted it on the grid the same night. Now I had to carry the creature solemnly out of the hut on to the open space outside and carve it up myself. But fortunately Moam the hunter helped me. The chief then indicated to me to whom I should beckon and offer a piece of ape meat, half a leg, half a forearm, a few ribs, or a piece of the tail. The head and brains he reserved for his wives, and he told me to keep back a fair-sized piece for my own lunch and dinner. Immediately after the feast, I wanted to sit down to my diary again. I always took pains to write down my impressions immediately, for there was the danger that after a short time much would seem too ordinary and humdrum to me for me to note it down. But scarcely was I rocking back and forth in my hammock with notebook and fountain pen than the chief stood before me, bow and arrow in hand, and an axe over his shoulder. Tersely, and with that solemn face of his, which I knew by now and almost feared, he was summoning me to go wood-clearing with him. Embora tra bahar cortar pau. Now, of course, I knew that sooner or later I should have to get down to work. Signor Regino and Salouy had already prepared me for this, but I wanted to postpone the inevitable for as long as possible, so I pretended not to hear. Vito repeated his demand. His face was growing visibly darker. Then I intimated to him that I wanted to go and wash my dirty linen. He seemed satisfied with this and left me in peace on this occasion, and in fact I did go with my shirts and khaki trousers down to the little stream, which was blocked almost knee-deep with branches, foliage, and mud. This was where the women drew their water for cooking, and old and young were accustomed to wash and drink. From the clearing, the crash of falling trees reached my ears, and accompanied my new occupation, soaping, rubbing, beating, squeezing, and wringing out, and then again soaping, rubbing, beating, squeezing. A few Indian women came to fill their pitchers further upstream. They looked at me for a while, giggled, and vanished again, pitcher on shoulder. When I returned to the hut, tired by the unaccustomed work, I found myself suddenly surrounded by a host of naked women, chattering eagerly away at me in words I could not understand. But then they held out to me their brightly colored necklaces, formed from various seeds, made unmistakable signs, and looked at me inquiringly. "So that was it, ladies. You want to make use of the absence of your husbands to indulge in a little barter." I could not resist it, and rummaging in my pack produced a few small mirrors, combs, and needles. But then suddenly 2 men appeared, returning, axe on shoulder, from their wood clearing, and the women scattered like a flock of startled sparrows. That night a solemn speech again roused me from my sleep. I pinched my arm to make sure that I was not dreaming. Tense and alert, I listened to the surge of excited words, but could understand only one. Karumpad, that is, old man. The voice seemed to be the same as I had already heard the previous night. It must have belonged to a man of middle age, and the prodigious solemnity with which he gave vent to his feelings made me shudder. When he reached the climax of his declamation and uttered one word 3 times with rising vehemence, I really felt cold shivers running down my spine, and yet I had no reason to believe that I was responsible for his anger. The next morning I asked Karumi, as I had on the previous occasion, what the nocturnal speech of the mysterious stranger meant, but the stubborn fellow would still not come out into the open. "Now say, I don't know," he muttered crossly. On the previous day I had again lent Mome my gun, and the young fellow obviously knew how to handle it. As before, I carried out a roast monkey, together with some cooked yucca roots and some maize, on to the clearing, and had the honor of distributing the banquet. Then I sat down again on my hammock, and devoted myself to my diary, And once again the chief appeared with bow and arrow and axe. He paused beside me and ordered peremptorily, "Come along, work, fell tree." Not even a deaf mute could have failed to understand his expressive gestures, but I acted as if I did not comprehend. "Come along, work, fell very little trees," he repeated in deadly earnest, and indicated with his hand that I should have to cut down only very thin trees. I still made no move to get up, but went calmly on with my writing, only from time to time looking in surprise at Vito. This was of course a piece of great impertinence towards my host, but I was interested to know how far I could carry it. The veins on the chief's head stood out with rage. With a face as black as thunder, he turned away and went back into the hut. After a short time he reappeared, and went off without deigning so much as to glance at me. In a moment the well-set figure of Iod appeared beside me. He was still quite a young fellow, but seemed to enjoy a particular prestige among his fellow tribesmen. Only some weeks later did I learn that he was Vito's only brother, and passed for a sort of deputy chief. Iod took up his position in front of my hammock, and talked earnestly away at me in broken Portuguese and eloquent sign language, until at last I took out my bush knife and trotted obediently along behind him. We crossed the small stream. From far off the sound of axes could be heard, and the dull thud of trees, occasionally accompanied by a shout of joy from the Indians. Along a broad trodden path we soon reached the clearing. Of recent weeks much hard work had been put in there. I estimated the area cleared at about 2½ acres. Some 30 men were busily at work, each one wielding an iron axe already somewhat worn down. Iod called the chief. He received me, the budding woodcutter, with a beaming face. "Cut down quite little trees," he repeated, and his face held the comforting assurance that I should not be worked to death. Then he gave his little son Conquad some directions which I did not understand. This youngster of about 12 looked me up and down with an unabashed gaze, and made a gesture of his hand in invitation. "Aka Kupura," he said, and went on ahead of me with a party of about a dozen boys. The youngest of them must have been about 8, the eldest perhaps 14. So I was posted to the juvenile squad. We were to fell the smaller trees with bush knives. After us came the men, and cut down the thicker trees, among which were some veritable jungle giants. Vito's boy pointed to a tree some 6 inches thick. "Hey on pura, hey on pura," he urged me, but I first took out my pencil and notebook and entered Heian Pura, which must mean cut this one down, and then I set about the unaccustomed work. It did not stop at one tree. Scarcely was it lying on the ground than Conquad was showing me another thicker one, but he himself and his companions were not idle. but laid on with their bush knives, with such a will that it was good to see. My fingers began to hurt. Soon I could scarcely hold the bush knife. Blisters formed on the palm of my hand and my fingers, and I was always glad when the men called over to us to stand clear, because some huge tree was about to fall. But then, when the mighty trunk had crashed to the ground amid a terrific splintering and crackling and shouts of joy, work went on again. It was annoying enough. The boys felled their trees with a neat wedge-shaped cut, for their blows landed unfailingly where they intended them. In doing this, many of the youngsters had to hold their knives in both of their small hands because the handle was too thick. The cuts I made, on the other hand, were jagged and irregular, and I took at least twice as long as my small colleagues. At last, even the boys seemed to have had enough. We dispersed into the bush, and now the forest became a vast gymnasium. The little fellows climbed up thick lianas like monkeys, rocked and swung backwards and forwards. Others would tug and pull at the tough creepers and try to pull their friends down. They were all shouting and laughing like children in a playground during a school break. From far away, the blows of the men's axes rang out, but the youngsters seemed no longer to be thinking about tree clearing. About midday, Vito came over to us. He asked his young hopeful about my work. The boy gave him a faithful report. With visible pleasure, he imitated my awkward blows and grinned across at me commiseratingly. The father laughed good-naturedly, just as if he were thinking, "We'll make something of you yet." It was time to return home. In the little stream we took a bath, and when we arrived home, the chief brought to each of us a gourd of unfermented thick maize chicha. The Indians swallowed it in a draught. Meanwhile, the women indefatigably dragged up huge quantities of yucca and yam tubers and piled them up in the main passageway near my hammock. For the time being, I was spared further work, and I spent most of the afternoon washing the head, arms, legs, or buttocks of a few small children, softening up old scabs, and painting with mercurochrome solution the ulcerating sores which probably arose from the many insect bites. One suspicious father sniffed at the red tincture and asked if it was blood, but finally allowed me to paint his little daughter with it. I myself was most eager to see whether I should emerge from my experiments as a good medicine man. The next night it was not the fiery speech of an angry Indian which deprived me of sleep, but the busy chattering and giggling of a cluster of women. At 2 o'clock in the morning they were actually at work, peeling and cutting up the huge pile of yams and yuccas in the light of a resin torch. Day broke, and the chief's little son came and fetched me to fell trees. I no longer resisted. It was true that my hand and arm were still giving me pain from the previous day, but lending a willing hand was probably the best way to win the confidence of the chief and his people. Besides, it was from the boys that I was picking up the language of the tribe most quickly. They did not understand a word of Portuguese, and so did not succumb at all to the temptation, as the older men did, of trying to say every single thing to me in 5 or 10 scraps of Portuguese. So I toiled away with a will, with sore fingers, and the boys readily gave me a language lesson. Cadere hooved, what is that? A perpe, nay, hey, on. Is that your bush knife? In the afternoon, I reported voluntarily for work, although the chief declared that I could now stay quietly at home because I must be tired. My keenness was rewarded. Instead of felling trees, I arrived just in time for a feast of honey. One of the tribesmen had found a bee's nest, and now the Indians were licking and sucking the honey and eating the combs, larvae and all. Then they discovered in a palm tree a few juicy larvae. One young fellow held out 3 of these squirming objects to me as well, but I refused his polite offer. He gaped in amazement, and then quickly bit off the heads of the worms, which were desperately wriggling, sucked out the thick yellowish liquid inside, and finally chewed the tough skin as well with visible relish. Earlier than the previous day, we left the clearing. In the Maloka, work was going ahead at full blast. What the chief had said about an approaching big carousal seemed to be coming true. The starchy roots had already disappeared into the cooking pots and grinding mills. The women now brought down maize from the store shelf, removed the husks, and stripped the cobs of grains. Ground nuts, too, were shelled and thrown into the maize and simmering tubers. Meanwhile, the women chewed away untiringly at roast maize and cooked tubers, spat out the mass, which was liberally mixed with saliva, into a gourd, and stirred them into the brew. The sight of the women brewing chicha fired the young men with enthusiasm. They struck up a rhythmical melody and took their places for a dance, nor could the little boys resist any longer. Armed with little bows and arrows or a cleanly peeled staff, they first went up to Vito, who was warming himself at a fire on the edge of the square. They made him sing them a verse. Then they hummed it after him to see whether they had caught it correctly. Vito nodded in assent, and now the little boys assembled in 3 ranks outside the hut and began to sing aloud. Keeping time, they took 3 paces forward and 3 back. As they did so, they always stamped hard on the ground with the right foot. The moon rose over the edge of the forest and threw a silver radiance onto the clearing. Francisco, little Conquad called me Oka Kika. He grasped me by the hand and dragged me into the line of dancers, forwards and backwards, and now into the dark hut. How the women start up aghast, how angry they get, and how protectively they stand in front of their chicha jars. But in the end, they also laugh at the high spirits of the righteous band, and no one takes amiss the din we make. For another day we were to work hard at felling trees. Boys and men went out to continue the clearing, and after a boy had sharpened my bush knife on a piece of sandstone, already considerably worn down, I followed as well, but no one seemed to have any enthusiasm left for work. The sounds of axe blows could be heard less and less frequently, and finally all the Tupari were devoting themselves exclusively to the toilet. With the juice of green ganipa fruit, they drew long stripes on each other's bodies, arms, legs, and faces. Then they ordered me to take off my shirt and submitted me to the same treatment. Soon my chest was resplendent with a large triangle, and my back was adorned with broad strokes and wavy lines. Nor did my face escape. The colorless genipa juice has the property of slowly penetrating the skin and dyeing bluish-black the parts treated. It is only after several days that the color begins gradually to wear off again. While we woodcutters were abundantly beautifying ourselves, the women were still very busy indeed. More and more maize and ground nuts were being cooked and pulped. But the most important task was to strain the brew, which was fermenting in numerous squat, rounded vessels. Any which was too thick had to be thinned down, and any which had turned out too thin was made up with thicker chicha. And the women, all of them brewers of experience, mixed, sampled, and smacked their lips. Chapter 10. Chicha, Dance, and Song. I awoke in the middle of the night. A resin torch and the many small camp fires lit up faintly the huge building. Dark shapes flitted back and forth. From all sides I heard words muttered in undertones, the gurgling and splashing of the chicha, and greedy swallowing. Far away, probably down by the stream, the loud notes of flutes rang out. That must be the boys. They had been cutting bamboo pipes the day before. I reached for my torch and looked at the clock. It was 12:30. When towards morning I awoke for the second time, old Totooka, who was accorded a sort of chief's status, visited me. He offered me a gourd of fermented chicha. I smelt, drank, and it tasted quite good. The old man was satisfied and withdrew, but then came one Indian after another, each with a bowl of chicha, and I was supposed to empty all these bowls. Pone, drink, it is good chicha, they urged me. What, you can't take any more? Was the question framed by their astonished faces. Then just be sick, and then you can go on again. And they gave me a very graphic demonstration of the process. Now I could not possibly drink the quantities which they, thanks to lifelong practice, could manage without difficulty, but I had to take a few mouthfuls from each, and there were many who came to act the host to me. The founder of the feast, the man, that is, who supplies the yucca and maize for brewing, places at the disposal of every man in the party a full jar. Such is the custom of the tribe. That is as far as the supply will go, for, of course, the host himself intends to drink deeply for 2 or 3 days. And so the fortunate owners drew quantities of this desirable beverage for themselves and their families, treated all their friends and relations, and above all the chiefs. The higher the sound mounted outside, the louder grew the noise in the hut. Some of the men took up simple bamboo flutes, struck up a few monotonous tunes, then lapsed into a little dance tune, and ran, keeping time, round the chicha jars. Tipsy men and women joined the dance, but the right atmosphere for engendering a proper general dance did not yet prevail. On the other hand, the Indians were suddenly seized with a strange urge to buy and barter. They knew from earlier visitors the things which doctors from the outside world were keen on having, and now they brought them along: bows and arrows, necklaces, adornment for ears and nose, and so forth. They even brought hammocks, spun, knotted, and dyed by the women themselves. In payment they wanted an axe or a bush knife. At last I could no longer cope with the rush. Great was the disappointment when I abruptly closed the market, shut up my boxes and bags, and put the Indians off until tomorrow. But there was enough chicha in the jars to drown their annoyance. By midday, one and another of them were already lying in their hammocks, dead drunk. Men and women drank and drank and drank, vomited when their stomachs were full, and began afresh, swilled more chicha, and bawled in chaotic confusion their tribal songs, and those which the journalist from Buenos Aires had taught them. Others, on the other hand, were made maudlin by their excesses. They squatted close to me and poured out their sorrows. In view of the simple nature of their complaints, our common vocabulary, helped out by sign language, was adequate. Great above all was their depression over the miserable payment which my traveling companions had received in Salouie for their weeks of work. In vain I tried to convince the Indians that the Alamau would send them axes and bush knives as soon as Senor R. arrived with the things. They simply could not grasp that Senor R. was the responsible owner, and Ongle was only his employee. Of the same nature were the complaints about Tibero and Maria, the guest from Buenos Aires, who had visited them a few months before. True, they had not been brabos, that is, wild, wicked, but on the contrary had sung a great deal, and indulged in fun and games. But then they had taken away hammocks, string bags, bows, arrows, and much else without paying a proper price. But I was assured by these trusting Indians they would come back in an aircraft, land in front of their hut, and bring payment. Shirts, trousers, shotguns, axes, knives, sugar, salt, anything which is precious in the eyes of an Indian. Many firmly believed in the promise of this miraculous return of the two journalists, but there were men among the Indians who would have preferred a bird in the hand, and who were beginning to doubt the promises of the travelers. Kwarume, the chief of the next hut, had also received from Vito a huge pot of chicha, and had been drinking deep. Now he was gloomily grumbling about the recent guests, but his great distress was over something different. Again and again he came back to the topic of the frightful, large-scale mortality which had been slowly obliterating his own and the neighboring tribes ever since the whites had penetrated the Rio Branco. He never grew tired of repeating how numerous the TUPARI had been when he was a boy. Then the strangers had come, and with them the common cold. "Ku," said Kwarume, imitating the cough which had carried off his fellow tribesmen. It was obviously the common cold which had wrought such havoc, for this illness, which is usually so harmless to us, comes from the Eurasian continent, and through 1,000 infections we have gradually become inured to it. On the other hand, every time the Indians came into contact with the whites, the common cold attacked them with great virulence, and probably ended in most cases in fatal bronchitis or inflammation of the lungs. Cough, death, ran Kwarume's shattering chronicle. Finally, out of the whole tribe, only 2 houses were left. He, Kwarume, still commanded only 10 families. Then Baito came and took possession of me. With a persistence which is in no wise yielded to his capacity for drink, he made a great point of convincing me how large were his holdings of yucca, tayoba, and yam tubers, maize, bananas, pawpaws, and tobacco, and how many different kinds of delectable animals there were in the forest of the Tupari. The Indians told of their neighbors too, and grim stories were related of the Hamno, who lived somewhere to the northeast. I asked the Tupari if they would accompany me there, but they refused in horror. No one knew the way, they said. There was no path at all leading there, and the Hamno were so savage that not one of us would come back alive. Karumi was a difficult case. Years before, while still a boy, he had visited the village of Guajara. He understood a little Portuguese, possessed a defective shotgun, and felt infinitely superior to his fellow tribesmen. On the very morning of the carousal, he had told me that he wished to have nothing to do with this gang of boozers, and had gone hunting. He had returned proudly with 4 black monkeys, but in the evening he had not been able to withstand the seductions of the Chicha, and now he was in that unhappy stage of drunkenness in which one abandons oneself to the gloomiest thoughts on existence and pictures to oneself how different everything might have been, and in which the bemused brain seeks a radical solution of all difficulties and an end of all tribulation. He would accompany me to the village of the white folk, he said. There I must buy him clothes, shoes, a hut, and much else besides. Nor were the women of his tribe of any use. I was to obtain for him a tall white wife. Outside, on the darkened square, almost the whole tribe had assembled. A dozen wind instrumentalists formed a ring round a pole rammed into the ground. In their left hand they held their bamboo trumpets. The right hand rested on the shoulder of the next man. To a simple melody they moved round in a circle with small sidewards steps. Soon they were joined by further circles of dancers, each carrying bow and arrow or shouldering an espada. The outermost ring was made up of women. They held hands or clasped each other round the waist or neck. To the rhythm of the music, the circles slowly revolved. From time to time they marked time and then took a few short paces back, still keeping the same time, and then, amid wild cries, resumed their slow revolution to the right. At one moment the trumpets sounded alone. The next, the dancers joined in singing. About a quarter of an hour a peculiar cadence marked the end of the dance. The dancers halted. The Indians roared a weird "ha" out into the darkness, and then scattered in all directions, filled their gourds, and squatted round great fires which were blazing in many places. Once again the trumpeters struck up, and this time I was forced to take part. A TUPARI simply dragged me into the circle of dancers. Afterwards he invited me to join him in the hut and taste his chicha, but scarcely had we entered the dimly lit building than two powerful arms seized me. A squinting woman with pendulous breasts laughingly invited me, Totooka Keka Hodana, grandfather, come and dance and sing. And before I knew what was happening, two women had drawn me between them. They clasped my hands and dragged me along in dance time behind a few fellows, who went on ahead of the host of women and children as chorus leaders. There was no escaping from this company. In vain I tried to return outside to the dancing men. The women also knew how to frustrate a retreat into my hammock, nor was it possible to resist their gentle compulsion without being rough and discourteous. My left-hand partner was a young woman. She carried her baby with her in a sling. Soon she grew sleepy and vanished in the darkness, but the old cross-eyed woman on my right seemed tireless. On her left danced a powerfully built girl of perhaps 15 years. Now and again the young girl cast a surreptitious glance at me. In the intervals she began to say to me various words in her language, and I attempted with more or less success to imitate them. She laughed heartily as I did so and showed 2 rows of healthy white teeth. The chorus leaders began afresh, and once again the old woman put her arm round my shoulder and bade me to do the same. Then someone plucked me by the hand from behind. Was it the old woman? No, she completely caught up in the rhythm, was stamping away. But the young girl, could it possibly be that she? And sure enough, she was seeking my hand, stroked it and squeezed it playfully. And when the next round took place, she contrived for me to be dancing between her and the old woman. Boldly she grasped me round the upper part of my body, which was bare, and placed my arm round her hips. And whenever the faint resin light burnt down for a moment, or if we were in deep shadow, she passed her hands caressingly over my body. I did not feel too happy about this unexpected turn the dance had taken. The little Indian girl, too, seemed to have an uneasy conscience, but my curiosity was aroused, and what man would not find it charming to encounter the favorable interest of a girl, even in the deepest jungle of the Mato Grosso? But I knew how jealous Indians were, and how was I to know whether the girl was promised, betrothed, or even married to someone? I was not at all attracted by the thought of suddenly receiving, in the darkness, an arrow in the ribs. At last the dancers grew tired. The musicians had already stopped playing and gone to bed. Suddenly my young partner vanished, and the woman no longer raised any objection to my climbing into my hammock. I awoke with a thick head. The revelry had already started again. To my distress, I noticed that my hammock was slung in probably the most unsuitable place in the whole hut. The spacious passage-way beside which I was installed was the favorite haunt of the enthusiastic toppers. There they were near the chicha jars, could watch the activity in the hut, but were not disturbed by the dancers. Moreover, this seemed to the men from the other hut, who had no beer jar of their own, just the right place to be treated by their more fortunate fellow tribesmen. And so I sat at the focus of the banquet, amid a howling crowd who were drinking, vomiting, and then drinking again. Even Karumi, the great traveler, had ceased to hold aloof from his fellows, swilled with them, bawled, and laughed. Suddenly, however, he turned to me. "Iod is furious with you and his wife," he said seriously. "What were you doing with his wife last night?" "Iod, his wife? Well, I knew her. She sat nearly every evening with him outside in front of the hut, having a meal. I had not seen her at all during the party. What could Karumi mean, then?" I tried to get a fuller explanation from him, but he no longer listened to me. Kwarume was in excellent form today. He even insisted that I should carry a calabash of chicha to his wife in the next hut. When I brought back the empty bowl, he led me through the maze of hammocks to an old woman. He gave her some of the thickish beer as well, but the old woman's thirst seemed to be less for chicha than for news. She put the bowl on the ground and began to question Kwarume. He sat in the hammock and pushed a stool over to me. I had just sat down when the old woman leaned over and passed her hand over my trousers, my bare chest, and my hair, and she seemed to be giving her opinion on everything to the chief. He laughed, and the old woman went on with her strange examination. Now she felt the lobes of my ears, my nostrils, and lips, putting her finger into my mouth and nose quite unconcernedly as she did so. Kwarume moved his head back and forth as she did so and put on a serious face. Then the old woman got up, untied from a sooty rafter a little bottle gourd, and produced from it a long needle. Kwarume pointed to the holes in his nose, lips, and ears. The old woman would now quickly make similar holes for me, he explained. "Be calm," he said encouragingly. "It won't hurt." Now, I was prepared to make considerable sacrifices, but this seemed to be asking a little too much. I assured the chief and the old woman that I preferred my face without holes, and besides, I very much feared the painful operation. The friendly pair remained of a different opinion, and if they assured me once, they did so a dozen times, that a man without plugs in his nose and lips, and without ear pendants, looked like a monkey. But I would not be talked round. Greatly disappointed, the old woman put her rusty needle away again, and tied the gourd to the beam. Late in the evening the TUPARI asked for my radio again. The drunken band listened reverently to Handel's Hallelujah chorus, but fatigue was too much for them. Two boys simply lay on the floor and went off to sleep, and soon the other listeners sought their hammocks. A few undaunted spirits turned their attention to the chicha again, and continued to kick up a din. On the third day the drinking bout grew distasteful to me. My stomach was not yet hardened enough to take a full part in it, and besides, no one had yet begun to think about cooking food. It was a lucky thing that at least the neighboring chief Kwarume thought of me and had a chicken killed for me. Kwarume had 2 wives, as was obviously only right for a chief. His host of children watched me as I ate. I thanked him, but expressed my surprise that he should have sacrificed one of his fowls when there were 4 apes grilling on his son's Karumi's gridiron. "Tomorrow the magician Vito will take snuff," announced Kwarume weightily. The apes seemed to be connected with this in some way. Full of eager curiosity, I looked forward to the next day.